You know what? This is the kind of topic that every single time we bring it up, everybody in the comments goes ballistic. Lego, stop making videos about this. Lego, stop talking about this. It's not going to happen. It's not worth talking about. It's not worth acknowledging. And, you know, I'm not going to go out there and say that's a necessarily incorrect take. It's not going to happen, right? But just because I'm making YouTube videos about it doesn't necessarily mean that it's particularly me that's going out there and bringing this up. If you've been following this channel for long enough, you recognize that I tend to make videos about things that other people are talking about. I rarely make the, oh, I think this should happen kind of video, because I like to steer my direction and say, hey, I saw this thing being talked about, this was in an article, this was on a radio hit, let's respond to it. Because today, what we're doing is we're going on the tsn.ca and reading a commentary piece by Travis Yost from earlier yesterday on September 3rd, 2024, considering an unlikely Sidney Crosby trade. Yeah, you know, we've talked about this a bunch. We've made our videos, we've had our talks, we've discussed the Montreal Canadiens as a potential destination for Sid the Kid. And while it is sort of a, you know, jack-in-the-box kind of ring around the rosy, we keep on talking about the same thing kind of deal, this article offers a little bit of a newer perspective on the matter, mostly because it was published on September 3rd. And at this point, seeing that Sidney Crosby, at the time of this article's publication, did not have a contract signed just yet, it opened the door to bigger and more meaningful conversations, you could say. Now, that's not to say that Sidney Crosby is totally not going to sign a contract before this video goes public on YouTube. If he does that, then this entire thing is out the window, and you're free to laugh at me in the comments section below. In fact, you don't even need any special circumstances to do that. If you want to laugh at me in the comments section below, that's totally your prerogative. But Travis Yost goes out there and opens this article by saying this: the NHL regular season is fast approaching, and before business picks up, I need to address the elephant in the room. The hockey community is underestimating the possibility of Sidney Crosby being moved at the trade deadline. Okay, thanks Travis Yost for bringing that up here. The notion of trading a player the caliber of Sidney Crosby can be silly to begin with, doubly so when you consider what he has meant to the Pittsburgh Penguins over the past 19 years. Even with the supernova Connor McDavid taking center stage these days, Crosby remains a top-billing star who is a freakish combination of skill and hockey smarts as he enters his 20th season. To be sure, the probability of him being moved isn't high. Crosby, the face of the franchise and on an expiring deal, could be extended before camp begins, and if the Penguins are competitive this season, it's hard to imagine they move their most capable player. And this is why I love these articles, man. They just go out there and talk about whatever. Hey, it's not gonna happen, but what if? What if Sidney Crosby does not sign a contract extension before the start of the season? What if he doesn't sign a contract extension as the season goes on? What if it's the trade deadline and he gets moved as a rental? The article then goes out there and talks about different teams that could go out there and potentially do this and why this might be a thing. Imagine for a moment that the Pittsburgh Penguins struggle early. It is precisely Sidney Crosby's loyalty to the franchise that would suggest a trade could be fruitful. The returns, even for a rental of Crosby, would be extraordinary, and under the same assumption that Crosby's loyalty is unwavering, he would return back to Pittsburgh with possibly more help rostered as soon as 2025-2026 on his retirement deal. Rebuilds can take years. A move of this magnitude could accelerate that timeline. And that is an idea that we rarely talk about as fans of the sport, mostly because it's so rare. Like, how often does a top-tier player get traded as a rental at the trade deadline and then re-sign with the team that he was traded from by the time the offseason starts? I mean, the one that always comes to my mind was Anton Vermette. He was traded from the Coyotes to the Blackhawks, won a Stanley Cup, and then re-signed with the Coyotes in the offseason. But, of course, Antoine Vermette was not Sidney Crosby. Totally not the same kind of player, not the same caliber of athlete. So if the Penguins really wanted to accelerate this rebuild, I mean, it's not a terrible idea For Dubas to give Crosby a playoff run in 2025 and be like, hey, if we trade you, we could get like multiple first-round picks, we could get some prospects, we can get a lot of stuff here. And then you're going to be a free agent, you're going to sign with us in the offseason, $8.7 million by 7 years, and what? Nothing really changes. You go to the playoffs, we stink, we get a high draft pick, we get some extra draft picks from trading you away, and then when you come back, the entire franchise is a lot better. At least in terms of its young depth. Maybe Sidney Crosby agrees to that. Who really knows? If he really is a team player for life with the Pittsburgh Penguins, this could be an interesting enough idea. Crosby may be wholly disinterested in chasing a Stanley Cup, especially considering the hardware he already has. But compared in relativity to playing out the string in March and April, that's the pertinent question. And if Crosby's ultimate goal is to win another Stanley Cup in Pittsburgh, there's nothing more selfless than signing up for this line of work. So the article then goes out there and talks about some teams that could go out there and acquire a Crosby rental. There are a bunch like Dallas, Winnipeg, Colorado, Detroit. And then there are the downright dreamy, if unlikely scenarios. No team would benefit more from a rental of Crosby than the Montreal Canadiens, owing to their relative weakness down the middle. In the case of Montreal, Crosby's presence and the displacement of one top-9 center would mean a net improvement of 5 wins in the standings. That is exceptional. The article uses goals above replacement and centers with and without Crosby charts to indicate what a wins above replacement number would look like with Crosby. And it's no surprise that if you took out one of the centers on Montreal, you swapped out a bottom of the lineup guy, you moved Suzuki to the second line, you moved, let's say, Doc to the third line, and then you had Crosby on line 1, hey, that's a huge improvement. Like, no disrespect to Nick Suzuki, of course, but still, Sid the Kid as a number 1 guy, playing with Juraj Slafkovsky, let's say you moved things around. I think my ideal first line is something like Crosby, Slafkovsky, and honestly, I feel like Doc would be a lot more useful on that line than a Cole Caulfield. Have Suzuki, Caulfield, and Newhook play together, have that 13, 14, 15 line. Yeah, Cole Caulfield, big shout out to him changing his number to number 13. It was kind of meant to be, honestly, the tribute to Johnny Gaudreau whilst living up to his NTDP number in number 13. Or you could have, like, Patrick Laine play with Crosby. How does that sound? Pretty good either way, right? And then you have yourselves the shuffling around of everybody else, right? This certainly is one of the better ideas, but the writer here, Travis Yost, does acknowledge how unrealistic it would be. One component to keep in mind is that when evaluating trade partners, Sidney Crosby has a full no-movement clause, which may or may not be a headwind. It will reduce trading partners, but also allows Crosby to self-select a team in the architecture of a trade. If Crosby has no interest in playing for a rival, nixed. A Canadian franchise, nixed. An American franchise because he wants to play back home temporarily, nixed. All this to say that a Crosby trade may be relatively unlikely, but the circumstances around both the player and the team give rise to it being a possibility. And with that, I'll leave you the link in the description if you want to go ahead and read the rest of the article yourself. There's a lot in it that we didn't talk about in this video directly, but just the main idea of Crosby potentially being a rental, helping the Penguins out by grabbing them some assets in the trade deadline, and then re-signing with that team in the offseason. I mean, it's a pretty good bet for the Penguins if you're not really going to be expected to doing any damage in the playoffs anyway. And for Sidney Crosby, while his heart may be set on staying in Pittsburgh in the long run, maybe making a detour back to Montreal to live up to where his dad was drafted all those decades ago would be an interesting idea. Of course, it would kind of sting for Canadiens fans to, like, see Crosby get traded to Montreal and then he leaves in free agency to go back to Pittsburgh. But if it gives the Canadiens a bit of excitement, if it gives them a playoff berth, then maybe it's really worth it. And who knows, if Crosby is, like, really good, he has some great chemistry with Laine, Slafkovsky, Caulfield, Suzuki, they play well together on the second line, and then you have maybe Doc in the first line, who really knows. If that is good enough to allow the Canadiens to maybe make the second round, who really knows? I mean, that sounds great. Doesn't really matter if you lose out on a prospect and a pick, if it means Sid the Kid becomes a Canadian for a few months, doesn't it? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.